Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the New School. My name is Karen Coney. I'm the director of the Viralist Center for Art and Politics here at the New School, and really honored and delighted to present to you this program on the Comradely Object, Art Against Reification. Since last winter, the Viralist Center has probed the depths of thingness in the face of dramatic new developments in political organizing, in public spheres, economics, and in the natural sciences. Numerous thinkers and makers, activists and artists have guided our explorations into these new understandings of materialism and materiality. For today's conference, however, perhaps the most succinct and immediate impetus comes from a sentence lifted from Alexander Rodchenko's spring 1925 letter to his wife, Varvara Stepanova, which goes as follows: "Our things in our hands must be equals, comrades, and not these black and mournful slaves." Written close to 90 years ago, it emerged from the unique collusion of art, industrial design, and architecture with a revolutionary, progressive political agenda for Soviet society. Surprisingly, perhaps, with greater temporal distance and greater skepticism towards the lofty goals of a modernist agenda, the call to recognize the object as more than a race or a thing, but as a partner, has only grown in resonance for us today. Perhaps not unlike the revolutionary potential it harbored in Russia, a call to reassess relationships between living and non-living matters lifts cumbersome barriers and opens the world as one interconnected organism, where actors of various kinds have the potential to partner. To me, Rodchenko's sentence is also evidence not just of the power of the object, but the power of words and language. And I'm thrilled that today's conversation will involve, in equal measures, masters of matter and masters of words. In alphabetical order, I'd like to thank the curators, artists, writers, scholars, and editors who are joining us today, who are Sanford Biggers, Julia Bryan-Wilson, Severin Fowles, Angie Kiefer, Christina Kiaer, Zoe Sheehan Saldana, Ingrid Schaffner, and Lucy Skyer. Michel Kuo will offer closing remarks of the conference around 4 o'clock, I believe, and Jonathan Bach, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs here at the New School, will be our guide and moderator and host throughout the proceedings of the day. The conference is organized in 3 parts. The 2 opening presentations by Christina Kiaer and Severin Fowles provide historical and theoretical foundations and place the aims and strategies of productivism, Russian productivism, in dialogue with recent efforts to theorize object agency. They are followed by 3 conversations between artists and scholars or curators or writers, exploring how things might be made to inhabit the various roles of companion, mediator, or organizer. And now, before I hand the microphone over to Jonathan Bach for introductory comments, I want to extend my deep appreciation to art historian Lyra Weibken, who conceived of this conference, Comradely Object, and helped us organize it. Warm thanks are also due to the Viralist Center's tremendous crew, headed by Annie Shaw, and our partners here at the New School, Pamela Tillis, Mark Fitzpatrick, Luana Elias, and Brian Case. And now it is my great pleasure to ask Jonathan to please come and offer introductory comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Bach. I teach here at the New School. I'm the chair of a small interdisciplinary program called Global Studies, and also appointed in the International Affairs program. I've had the honor to be involved with a number of Viralist Center events over the years here, and I have to say that the Viralist Center really is the most avant-garde, interdisciplinary, innovative, and overall fun place here at the New School, and that's a tall order because we've got a lot of those kinds of things here at the New School. So once again, a very big thank you to Karin. Thank you for inviting me and to the staff of the VR List Center. So today we're here to explore in the larger context of thingness. As Karin mentioned, there's been a number of events dealing with materiality and neo-materiality and different ways of approaching the material in an age where a lot of things have become dematerialized, supposedly. We are here to explore, to unpack, to rethink, or maybe unthink, or otherwise discuss the legacy of 1920s avant-garde art, specifically Productivism, which you'll hear much more about in a moment. But of the many dimensions that this era evokes and these questions evoke, I'll start off with just a few that piqued my interest when Karin asked me to say a few words at this event. So I think one of the things which today's event will draw attention to is the question of understanding the changing role of the object, or our changing understanding of the object, the thing, as a kind of co-conspirator. Rodchenko's quote, which Karin mentioned before, that wonderful quote in the beginning of your program, where he says, "Things must be equals, comrades, and not black and mournful slaves." I heard in that the prehistory of Bruno Latour, of a lot of work in science and technology studies on questions of non-human interaction, of human-machine interaction, and it would be very interesting to think about the object coming from Rodchenko and this prehistory and connecting it to some of the ways in which the thing is thought of today. This leads to a rethinking necessarily, I would argue, of the question of everyday life, whether it's Büt or Alltag, all the various ways in which everyday life, that thing which is both so near and so far, that thing which was supposed to have been dissolved, and the thing which we can never escape from, which surrounds us and is both banal and deeply troublesome and deeply ideological. So everyday life is necessarily implicated when we talk about the object. And I think that by rethinking everyday life, we have to focus our attention on those who organize and form the everyday, whether they are, as Boris Arvatov, one of the productivists, said, the workers, artists, and engineers, or whoever the equivalent of the workers, artists, and engineers are today, who are organizing and forming everyday life. I don't know. Corporate masters, consumers, users. So whether as tragedy or as farce, I think it's quite interesting to see how artists are now interwoven into the social fabric today in a way which the productivists could probably only dream of, though I don't know what they would make of it today. Today in contemporary culture, you have art and artists as trendsetters, as designers, as cogs in the corporate wheel of distributed labor that plays on the deep ambiguity of the do-it-yourself culture between autonomy and exploitation. This is a theme which the Vera List Center, in fact, has explored in earlier events. So I'm wondering today whether, or I'm curious to see how we can discern insights from the 1920s avant-garde art for understanding the way that art and artists today navigate between ideology and utopia, between politics and poetics, without necessarily betraying either one of those. And wondering how we can employ the term reification if we have a new relationship, or at least a rethought relationship to things themselves, in a way where things no longer contain some kind of essence, some kind of authenticity, which we can access and therefore merely awaken us from our Benjaminian deep sleep. So the fabulous collectivity of assembled artists and creators, scholars and writers who we have here today will help us think through some of these issues. But before I turn the podium over to our first speakers, Karin asked me to say very briefly a few words about my own relation to things and objects, since I come from a world of social science and not from the world of art. So very briefly, in recent years, one of the things that I have been looking at is the legacy of former East Germany, known then as the German Democratic Republic, the socialist East Germany, through its material traces today, more than 20 years after its demise. And for that, there has been a lot of attention paid to the role of objects. Now, objects have come to play a very significant role in trying to come to terms with the East German past, whether it's through the recreation of Eastern products, Ostprodukte, that became fashionable again or were reintroduced. The film Goodbye Lenin, if any of you have seen that, played a key role in bringing this out, connected to the idea of nostalgia for communism. Or in the form of one area which I have been researching, the private museums of everyday life under socialism. These are museums. There are about 24 of these now that have cropped up in the last decade or so in former East Germany, where, for the most part, private individuals are assembling large amounts of objects, not necessarily cared for in ways that conform to curatorial or museum standards, but are heaped in various constellations that try to show what everyday life was like under socialism through the medium of the object. And these are banal yet burdened objects in at least 4 ways. I'll conclude with this and move on to the first speaker. The first is that these objects are innocent yet very implicated, because at the same time that they are portrayed as the objects that people used in everyday life, whether it's a certain kind of detergent or a particular toy or a type of chair or a cupboard, really the idea under socialism was that there was no such thing as an innocent object, because all objects had to, in some way, shape, or form, express socialist values. As Gunther Mittag, who was the, one of the Central Committee members in East Germany, responsible for the economy, as he put it back in the 1970s, early 1980s, I think he made this quote, "Consumption is not a process of needing something and getting it," he said, unlike in the capitalist West, "but it's a process by which the socialist personality is created." So there was a lot of attention paid to the most banal of objects as part of creating the socialist personality. So these objects themselves, as banal as they may be, are situated in an attempt to create the socialist personality. There's also the question of how we value these objects today. How is the unmemorable, to use a term from Nikolai Vukov, made memorable, and how are the experiences of people under everyday life, under socialism, made accessible and understandable and legible through these kinds of museums? A third interesting element, I think, that is relevant for the larger discussion today is the way in which these items became and have become thought of as authentic in ways which might seem odd to a Westerner who's looking at them for the first time. Many of these objects are of poor quality, mass-produced, and plastic, and you look at them and you wonder about their claim to authenticity. But this authenticity is also based both on the ideas that lay behind the objects, the kind of experience during the use of the objects, and also the way in which today they are presented as a form of resistance to the present. And the final interesting dimension of these, I think, is that these objects, in many cases, especially in the museum, and especially in the more professional of the museums, have gone through an apotheosis and have been turned into kitsch, despite the extreme ideological war waged against kitsch under socialism. So this leads to a real irony that these objects that were the product of an attempt to eradicate kitsch and bad taste now have a status of coolness, in large part because of their kitsch effect. And we'll end with an interesting quote from Vladislav Todorov, who points out that communism created ultimately effective aesthetic structures and ultimately defective economic ones. And this led, he says, to a deficit of goods, but an overproduction of symbolic meaning. And Todorov asks, looking back now after the end of communism at the experiment, he says, are we to be Fortinbras, that is, sweeping out the ruins of what's left behind, or Horatio, collecting and assembling what's left into shocking figures? So on this note, I'd like to turn it over to the first speakers. Today, we will have 2 sessions this morning before our coffee break. First, we will have opening presentations by Christina Kiaer and Severin Fowles. Then I'll pop up here briefly and introduce the next 2 speakers, Julia Bryan-Wilson and Zoe Sheehan Saldana. So let me start by saying very briefly that Christina Kiaer is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at Northwestern University. I'll let you get most of the detail from the program where we have bios, but I'll note that she's the author of a book with a fabulous title, Imagine No Possessions, The Socialist Objects of Russian Constructivism. And she was also, among many other things, a consultant curator for an exhibition at the Tate Modern back in 2009 on Rodchenko and Popova defining constructivism. She will be our first speaker, and she will be followed by Severin Fowles, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Barnard College uptown here, where he teaches archaeology and teaches a number of very interesting classes, including one that's incredibly relevant for us here on thing theory. And he works primarily with the landscape, material culture, and local communities of northern New Mexico. So with that, I will turn it over to Christina Kiaer.
Hi. You've been looking now for a while at my little slide here with the title that I came up with, The Comradely Object of Russian Productivism. I mean, obviously cribbed from the ideas of the conference. So I thought that I would start with the idea of productivism, what that was. What am I pushing? Forward. I tried all the buttons. So
Yeah, so if you
aim
just
it at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you have a problem, I
Okay,
can.
that's great. No, I just needed to know. Okay, so you're looking here at a series of well-known photographs of various actors and players in productivism, and the top center is Osip Brik, this famous photograph by Rodchenko where he has the Lev logo in his glasses. In the first issue of the journal Lev in 1923, Osip Brik wrote a brief article with the title Into Production with an exclamation point at the end of it. And he took Alexander Rodchenko as his example, and that's who you see on the top left here, dressed in his production suit. And he opens the article like this. Rodchenko was an abstract artist. He has become a constructivist and a production artist, not just in name, but in practice. Rodchenko knows that you won't do anything by sitting in your own studio, that you must go into real work, carry your own organizational talent where it is needed, into production. So Brik was one of a group of Marxist critics who promoted the so-called Productivist platform within the larger umbrella of Russian constructivism. And so all the people you see here on the screen are some of the prominent productivists. So Rodchenko, then on the upper right, Varvara Stepanova, who's sitting there drawing with a compass. Here, Lyubov Popova, and here's a caricature of them on their way to the factory with their fabric designs. So they actually entered into production because there was a factory that mass-produced their designs. Then here, in the nice fur collar and the pipe, is Jorgensen, who is in some ways, Karol Jorgensen is one of the kind of Productivist in the sense that he actually stopped making art and became an industrial inventor and went and worked in a metal rolling factory. And we know this from the research of Maria Goff. So he's in a certain way, like he's on a continuum, probably the most productivist of the productivists. And then, of course, also Vladimir Tatlin, you see him here on the right with some of his designs for a stove and a suit and other everyday objects, who also is known as the father of constructivism. So these are some of the main players. But if the debates leading to the formulation of productivism had emphasized industrial technology, engineering, the factory, and so on, most of the things that actually got made ended up being much less about technology in the factory and much more about the invention of a new kind of object, a material object that would be useful and which was peculiarly affective or emotional, and that is to say, the title of this conference, the Comradely Object. So the Comradely Object is a phrase from my book, which is exciting, and I'm very happy to be here to kind of revisit these ideas in this very forward-looking context with contemporary artists and critics. So I do want to stop and just thank Lara Weibgen for the idea and Karen Kwoni for the invitation and the New School and the Vera List Center. But then what I thought that I would do is just start by reading the first page of my book, because there that Rodchenko quote appears, so we're going to hear it for the third time now. So you're really, really going to remember it. It comes from his letters that he wrote to Stepanova, in fact, his wife, from Paris. And so as I said, I think I kind of said this best back then, so I'm just going to read it now. The light from the East is not only the liberation of workers, writes the Russian constructivist Alexander Rodchenko in a letter home from Paris in the spring of 1925. The light from the East is in the new relation to the person, to woman, to things. Our things in our hands must be equals, comrades, and not these black and mournful slaves as they are here. In these evocative lines, Rodchenko names a new kind of emotionally affective object, the comradely object of socialist modernity. Unlike the commodities he encounters on his visit to capitalist Paris, which elicit a possessive relation that makes the objects into slaves, things made in the socialist East will actively promote egalitarian socialist culture. They will replace the pleasure of commodity possession, not with its presumed communist opposite of material renunciation, but with something far more peculiar and psychologically powerful: the material object as an active, almost animate participant in social life. This book investigates this concept of the socialist object as Russian constructivism's original contribution, not only to the history of the political avant-garde art movements of the 20th century, but also to the theory of a non-capitalist form of modernity. The socialist object addresses a fundamental problem in Marxist thought. What happens to the individual fantasies and desires organized under capitalism by the commodity fetish and the market after the revolution? Capitalism, in its honing of the commodity form that endlessly organizes and gives form to these desires, has a profound weapon that socialism cannot simply cede to it. The constructivist counterproposal to this weapon is the object as comrade. So we might then ask, what might an object as comrade look like, and how would it work? So in the short time that I have this morning, or I guess afternoon, I'm going to concentrate on just one kind of productivist object to try to make a case for its comradeliness. And that's going to be this thing called the Constructivist flapper dress. You see here a window designed by Lyubov Popova from 1924. For which she drew a constructivist flapper dress. Now, I don't want to make the case just on the basis of Rodchenko's poetic and very personal words from Paris about the comrade and the things in our hands. I also want to recruit a more methodical and sober writer, the young productivist theorist Boris Arbatov, whom we already heard about from Jonathan, who developed an entire theory of the object under socialism. So he wrote this pivotal essay in 1925, Byt I kultura wieści, Everyday Life and the Culture of the Thing, where he attempted to imagine how socialism would transform passive capitalist commodities into active socialist things. So he called for, quote, the thing as the fulfillment of the psychological laboring capacities of the organism, It's kind of a mouthful. So the physiological laboring capacities of the organism as a social laboring force, as an instrument, and as a co-worker. So these new socialist objects that would be connected like co-workers with human practice would produce these new experiences of everyday life, new relations of consumption, and new human subjects of modernity. It was pitched at a very high level of ambition, this essay. So we're adding the terms instrument and co-worker, as well as comrade, to test out against this idea of the productivist fabric and clothing designs that Popova and also Stepanova worked on. Stepanova and Popova. I'll have more to say about these two portraits in a minute. One of Popova's geometric fabric designs was a bona fide successful productivist object. It was, in fact, mass-produced at the Moscow textile factory where she and Stepanova worked. And that's the textile design that you see here on the cover of Lev, where it was illustrated. And I think often, especially when I'm teaching Constructivism, one of the big questions that comes up was, well, were they successful? And I always say, like, I don't think that's the most interesting question because, but in this case, this fabric was mass-produced in a factory and sold widely throughout Russia. And so it appears on the cover of Lev also because that issue was dedicated to Popova after her premature death at age 35. So it was a very short career that she had, unfortunately. And I like it to compare it just to a painting that she made in 1918. It's called Painterly Architectonics with Pink Semicircle. So you can kind of see just her kind of constructivist move of how she took the kind of individual sensual touch of this painting, which is obviously geometric and linear, but how she pushes it in sort of toward a more mechanical drawing set of forms in this kind of constructivist way to kind of mechanize and technologize what she's doing. So simplifying and transforming this spatial illusionism into this kind of a different kind of spatial illusionism with a kind of target-like fabric that pops out at you. And I also would like to say that textile design has been a traditionally feminine practice associated with the decorative arts. So some people say, well, it's not really that interesting that they design fabrics because women have always done that. It's not what's so radical about that. But what's important is that Constructivism itself was interested in leveling that kind of hierarchy between the fine and the utilitarian arts. And so that her work was not in any way seen as a step down or away from the kind of sort of technological goals of productivism. In fact, it was very much celebrated as a success. And in the magazine, the Lev editors wrote, quote, Popova was a constructivist productivist not only in words, but in deed. When she and Stepanova were invited to work at the first state cotton printing factory, no one was happier than she was. Day and night, she sat making her drawings for fabrics, attempting in one creative act to unite the demands of economics, the laws of exterior design, and the mysterious taste of the peasant woman from Tula. Not sure why Tula, but a good provincial town. And so here's just a photograph I have of the actual factory where they were delivering their fabric designs. So according to the Lev editors, Popova aimed not only to solve the technical problems of utilitarian form, that what we would think of as a kind of straight productivist project, but also to appeal to consumer desire, to the peasant woman from Tula. And I think that's where some of the notion of the comradely object can come in. So just a bit of background on why we're even talking about consumerism and the taste of peasant women if we're in the middle of a communist revolution, just historically that this was a moment in 1921 or 1924 of the so-called new economic policy that was the economic system from 1921 on, which partially legalized private trade and manufacture to jumpstart the economy. So we're in a kind of a semi-capitalist economic system, even within an overall very much ideologically socialist system. And at this time, state-owned businesses like the first state cotton printing factory had to turn a profit. Like they weren't being subsidized by the government. They had to turn a profit because the system was semi-capitalist. And one of the things that they did, therefore, was to choose quite safe and conservative designs, often based on pre-revolutionary designs or on Western styles. So there was this kind of disjunction between the socialist ideology and then the actual kinds of objects that got made. And one of my favorite examples for that This is from 1923, and it's a menu that I found in an archive. And it's a menu from Leningrad, and you can see you could buy these pre-printed menus, and then up at the top it says menu, and then you could write in every day what you were serving at your restaurant. But all of these little ads, I think it's just sort of shocking to think that this is Russia in 1923 when we think of sort of Lissitzky and, geometric things. These little pictures of fashionable ladies in nice suits, men in suits, an advertising for, carpeting, and all sorts of wines, chocolates, all kinds of things. So just to think about that they're kind of intervening into a quite messy, one could say, commercial visual culture. And I was not ever able to find an advertisement for the actual factory that they worked for, but these are ads from that time for two other factories or trusts that made fabrics and clothing. And so I just emphasize again the kind of traditional nature of the sort of visual culture that Popova and Stepanova saw themselves intervening into. This is a particularly great poster here, I think, because you've got this model, on a runway. You have these little tiny exoticized black boys unfurling spools of cloth, which goes completely against all the kind of rhetoric of socialism against racism and so on, and exoticism. And then you've got this audience where you've got a fashionable lady, you've got a peasant woman with a red scarf tied under her chin, and here you've got a little Red Army soldier with a red star on his hat. So this kind of idea about some kind of entry of fashion into a Soviet context. And so my interest is in how Popova and Stepanova knew that their work would somehow have to respond to this NEP marketplace, this market for fashion. And if you look at their designs, this is Stepanova's very famous designs from Lev for sports clothing, and then these are two of the dresses that Popova designed. And so I see a kind of a split where Stepanova is basically having nothing to do with any of this fashion stuff. She's interested in this androgynous linearity, and I think that her designs are kind of anticipating a socialist future of class and sexual egalitarianism right from the start. And in that way, one could say that her objects, her sports outfits, one can see them as co-workers leading the human subject basically into the light, toward greater efficiency and expediency, not to be fashionable, because fashion is, we know, a relic of capitalism and something that goes on in the West. Whereas Popova, on the other hand, there's a little bit more of a gray area, and concurrently with her textile design work, which was absolutely geometric, as we've seen, she drew dozens of fashionable women's clothing designs that incorporated her fabric designs, but in ways that are much sort of closer to how fashion works. And that's where I come back. I want to take these two photographs as absolute shorthand for the way that we have different models. So this is a Rodchenko photograph of Stepanova, very famous with her kind of intense gaze down and her refusal of the individually drawn object, the kind of prosthesis as she makes her drawings for the circles for her design. And then this photograph, it's kind of cheating because the photograph of Popova is a few years earlier, 1918, so she's not a constructivist yet. But I just love this fur-lined blouse. It's just that Popova was someone who had grown up very wealthy and was known as somebody who was very fashionable. There's a great quote from Rodchenko when he says, when we first met her in 1915, she would have nothing to do with us. She was too fancy. And when she left the gallery, there was this memory of her beautiful fashions and the scent of expensive perfume. And I'm interested in the way that that kind of personal investment in fashion then I think has this effect later of making her do slightly more complicated things with her desire for making a constructivist flapper dress as opposed to just trying to get rid of the whole idea of fashion. So, and it's important to emphasize that there was such a thing as a concept of Soviet fashion at this time. So this is taken from the Housewives magazine from 1925, this fashion spread here. There were fashion designs published in it every month, but it was a Soviet state-run magazine, and in its first editorial in 1922, the first issue that was published after the revolution, the editor declared, "Our readers may think that fashion has died out, But our old friend fashion, powerfully ruling the female half of the human species, had no intention of dying. And then it goes on, the magazine kind of develops this rhetoric of what it's like to be fashionable but to be communist at the same time. I wouldn't say they do a very good job. It's sort of, they have articles on, say, the new abortion law, and then they have articles on Paris fashions, and they're in the same magazine, but there's not a lot of work going on to kind of make those two things come together. But so if we think about Popova, I'm sort of interested in, this is the dress design by her that is at the centerpiece of my chapter on this in the book, and I'm just really obsessed with this dress, and I'm interested in the way that it seems to kind of speak to this dress. I mean, that there are these kinds of similarities, but then also important differences. And you can see it's the same fabric that I was talking about earlier from the cover of Lev. So the main visual interest of Popova's dress stems not from the expensive fabrics and complex cuts of the designs in the magazine, but from the bold graphics of her constructivist fabric. And she recreates the kind of stylish effects of these elongated dresses. I mean, I just call them flapper dresses. That's a kind of a shorthand. That was just the style of these drop-waisted dresses of the mid-1920s. But she has this kind of outsized sash that's doing the work of gathering together this sort of voluminous fabric of her dress. And then this big this huge collar that a friend of mine a long time ago said he thought it kind of looked like a bunched napkin. But you know, so it's not as elegant as the way that the big collar is working in the fashion design, but it's basically kind of recreating these stylish effects in perhaps a slightly clumsy way, but also in a way that's very easy to make. The dress is ready for mass production, that the voluminous folds mean that it's sort of two pieces of fabric just sewn together with these very, very limited aspects, limited things that are added to it to make it stylish in order to make it much easier to mass produce. You don't need to have a tailor or a seamstress sitting in her workshop sewing it. So, as I say, this dress, slightly clumsy as it may be, is ready for mass production. And I actually want to read just one more paragraph from my chapter on this. The argument proposed here is not that Popova's clumsy design is a failure, a sign that she had ventured in her constructivist fervor into an area of practice for which she was not trained, a criticism frequently leveled at the constructivists. Rather, this dress is an object that shows us how it is made. It hides nothing, but rather renders its mode of production transparent. It wants to wear its constructivist heart on its fashionable sleeve, as it were. It wants to incorporate the consumer fantasy of fashion into the constructivist rhetoric of transparency. The purpose of this flapper dress is not only to clothe the female body efficiently, but to elicit the belief that, in wearing this dress instead of a Western or NEP-produced one, the woman who wears it is more rational and more emancipated than non-socialist wearers of flapper dresses. This belief is elicited through, and will eventually take the place of, the fantasies of femininity that normally function to give such a dress its exchange value on the market. It becomes an instrument of social change, as in Arbatov's description of the socialist object as an instrument and as a co-worker. So Popova's historical experience as a woman gave her contributions to constructivist art and to life a specificity and an urgency that helped to define it. At the same time, one of the reasons that she had the historical opportunity as a woman artist to make such an extraordinary contribution to this movement was constructivism's overall rejection of the gendered hierarchies of artistic practice and its openness to working within the traditionally feminized domain of everyday life. And this is part of a larger argument, but that Tatlin is making pots and pans, Rodchenko is designing advertisements for caramels and cookies. So there's an overall kind of, as I say, a kind of a rejection of some of the hierarchies of what's considered important and lesser kinds of artistic practice. The Bolshevik discourse, so now I'm talking about the Bolshevik discourse, not just the constructivist discourse, of female consciousness and emancipation. There was this discourse, even if there wasn't as much action as one might have hoped in terms of egalitarianism, was bound up for the constructivists with the idea of the active comradely object that can transform everyday life. And Rodchenko makes this connection between women's emancipation and the ideals of the constructivist object uncharacteristically explicit in the quote that we keep hearing, because it's the new relation to the person, to woman, to things. And when he is in Paris designing his workers' club, and he writes these things, the turns of phrase suggest that for him, the rejection of the passive commodities he saw in Paris was associated with the rejection of Parisian conventions of passive femininity and of women as sex objects. So he keeps talking in his letters about the objectified women of Paris. He sees women on the streets wearing short, tight skirts. He repeats that a lot. Women performing naked in the cabarets. There are no naked cabarets in the Soviet Union. It's a very chaste society. And he writes finally, in short, the cult of woman as thing. And he's very disgusted by it. In contrast, he imagines a new relation to the woman in the Soviet East. And he doesn't quite go on to theorize it, but I think we can surmise that he imagined woman as an equal and a comrade, somewhat on the model of this Soviet campaign for the emancipation of women. So to sum up, or to kind of end on this particular note, the term comrade in Russian, tovarish, is masculine, but the comradely object, I think, also has a very strong feminist dimension. And I think that's just one of the dimensions that might continue to make it relevant to us today. And so, I feel, to state the obvious, we're still contending with consumer culture today, just like they were during NET, but ours is obviously much amplified. And so for me, the premise of this conference, that these comradely objects of contemporary artists today might continue to retool the political force of productivism, is a very hopeful sign. So I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you all so much.
I don't have any slides, but this will be a lovely thing to have up there while I'm talking. I'm very grateful to be here this afternoon alongside a really remarkable group of folks from whom I clearly have a great deal to learn. But I find myself compelled to begin my comments today by pointing out that the organizers were very brave indeed to invite an archaeologist to offer his thoughts on the intersection of contemporary thing theory and Russian productivism. And one of the reasons I say this is that because most archaeologists, anthropological archaeologists at least, they've traditionally worked quite hard at policing the disciplinary boundary that separates them from art historians. And I don't want to overstate the case, but it's certainly true that as recently as the 1990s, when I was in graduate school, the label art historian tended to be tossed around accusatorily as a criticism to describe fellow archaeologists who had lost their way, who had forgotten the true mandate of the discipline and fallen into a kind of object fetishism. Art historians were strange creatures, our advisors warned us. They have yellow eyes and tails. They're going to try and seduce you, so beware. Now, it's interesting to consider the source of this irrational fear. Superficially, we might say that there were, for want of a better word, cultural reasons for keeping art history a safe distance away. By and large, American archaeologists of the 20th century fancied themselves as salt-of-the-earth empiricists, proud of the dirt on their jeans. Like Alexander Rodchenko, archaeologists liked to wear work boots in photographs for partially political commentary. And they were even prouder of the fact that their primary objects of study, the artifacts that we examined to build accounts of history, that these objects of study were merely the humble bits and pieces of unwanted refuse that humans had discarded. Egalitarian refuse, significantly, that provide access to the lives of not just the rich, but also the poor. Archaeologists study trash. This is the sort of thing we were supposed to proclaim with pride. Which is to say that, like Vladimir Tatlin, we embraced and still do embrace everyday objects as part of an effort to lend support to the masses. In the 1970s, in fact, archaeologists at the University of Arizona began to develop a subdiscipline now known as garbology, focused on the study of modern trash, mostly mass-produced middle-class commodities, of course. Modern trash that was pulled directly from trash cans and landfills. So the practice of archaeology was, and really still is, conceived of as a rigorous form of garbage collection and analysis. So it shouldn't surprise us then that art history implicitly served as a foil, as the image of an elite discipline in which intellectuals holding wine glasses mulled over elite things, which is wildly unfair, I realized, but that was the stereotype. There were deeper issues, of course, foremost of which was a palpable worry among archaeologists that if they weren't careful, they could easily lapse into forgetting that the objects they studied were merely a means to an end. Understanding the artifact is not the goal, it was commonly said. Rather, one was supposed to search for the Indian behind the artifact, for the people behind the things. And there were others who went further. In the heyday of 1970s systems theory, one prominent archaeologist, Kent Flannery, one of my former advisors, proclaimed that his concern was neither with the artifact nor with the Indian behind the artifact, but with the system behind the Indian behind the artifact. Material objects were to be used only as a bridge or a guide toward deeper, hidden, and increasingly abstract truths. In retrospect, such statements strike me almost as theological, as if they could have just as easily been spoken by John of Damascus in the 8th century. Regardless, the art historian, or what archaeologists naively imagined to be the art historian, again served as a kind of foil, as the image of the idolater who worshipped falsely things in themselves. I'm pleased to report that that situation has changed a great deal during the past 2 decades, as an increasing number of my colleagues have come to participate in what's variously referred to as the material turn, the turn towards things, the new materialism, or as Bill Brown so nicely puts it, thing theory, which has had the welcomed effect of creating a great many new cross-disciplinary conversations, as you're all clearly aware. What is thing theory, then? There are a number of ways to answer this question, I suppose, but let me offer one sketch colored by my particular position as an anthropologist. Thing theory refers to a movement, an evolving sequence of interventions that's slowly leading us to accept the subjectification of objects. And this movement, we might further note, has been given its form and structure through a series of core questions that are challenging us to think in different ways about a great many issues, from religion to architecture to ontology to consumption and on and on. Now, the first question is, of course, a familiar one. What do things mean? How have we invested ourselves or inscribed certain cultural information into things, and how, as analysts, do we read those messages back? These were important questions during the early and mid-20th century. In System of Objects, Baudrillard wrote from a Lacanian perspective that objects have always been, as he put it, I love this turn of phrase, the finest of domesticated animals, by which he meant that whatever we're unable to project onto other humans, we project onto our pets, or better yet, onto our objects. As a mirror, the object is perfect, he suggested, precisely because it sends back not real images, but desired ones. In a word, it, the object, is a dog of which nothing remains but faithfulness. Well, nowadays, these claims seem very dated. We may still be interested in the meaning of things, but no one today could get away with saying that an object is merely a faithful mirror or a blank page on which cultural texts are written. On the contrary, during the 1990s, a great deal of effort across multiple disciplines was expended to explore the way objects strike back, the way media determine messages, the way the very notion of agency inevitably dissolves into vast networks of people and things in various collaborations, all of which amounted to a sustained critique of representationalist approaches to the study of material culture. If what do things mean was a question for the 80s, what do things do became a burning question in the 90s. Within anthropology, Alfred Gell's well-known text, Art and Agency, addressed this most directly, perhaps, but there's no question that Bruno Latour has been the most influential champion of an object-oriented social analysis. Latour's work, his project of symmetry in particular, has had an especially wide readership because it operates on so many levels at once. Relational metaphysics merges with revisionist history and reverse ethnography, all in the service of a bold new vision of what we might refer to as a post-humanist politics, which is heady stuff, to be sure. And with respect to the conference theme, Latour's writing, as was actually pointed out in the introduction, would also seem to offer certain obvious parallels to 1920s productivism. Latour encourages us, for instance, to think of humans and non-humans as members of a common symmetrical collective. He challenges us to envision a democracy extended to things, a veritable parliament of things in which, as he puts it, the serfs, objects, became free citizens. Might we read this as a return to the productivist idea of objects as comrades? Well, I think that's seriously oversimplifying the situation. A socialist object is surely not the same as a democratic object, any more than socialism is the same as democratic capitalism. In short, the current interest in ontological symmetry really has little to do, from my vantage point, with the on-the-ground effort to rein in the burgeoning class inequalities that are so much in the headlines today. Regarding the question of object agency, though, let me simply add that this continues to be a matter of ongoing debate, much though that debate has now been folded into conversations about materiality. Materiality, it's often claimed, is the source of the object's agency, much in the way Russian constructivists perhaps saw materials strongly influencing the artistic forms they assumed. But that's another overly simple comparison, perhaps. Indeed, the claims today regularly go far beyond this. These days, materiality also tends to be discussed as a possession of materials. One talks about the materiality of stone or of iron, for instance. The implication being that materiality is to materials as subjectivity is to subjects. These are, in other words, ontological claims that are now being debated. So where are we now then? If what do things do was a driving question in the 90s, what new questions have emerged in the past decade? Well, there certainly are those who are exploring even greater subjectifications of the object world. W.J.T. Mitchell now asks the provocative question, what do pictures want? Explicitly linking the question of the image to the question of the subaltern. Perhaps this is where we're heading, from the problem of meaning to the problem of agency, and now on to the problem of desire. From what do things mean to what do things do to what do things want. Others have taken us a step further and broached the very difficult question of whether or not supposedly lifeless objects have their own non-human modes of perception. The philosopher Graham Harman has even inaugurated what he calls a carnal phenomenology that sets out to understand how objects are given not to other humans, but how objects are given to other objects. Again, all of this marks a radical move to subjectify the object world, not just a blurring of the subject-object divide, mind you, but an outright dismissal of the ontological category of object itself, and a repopulating of the world solely with subjects, with things. A thing, let us say, is an object that has somehow begun to reveal that it isn't an object at all. It's an object that's begun to object, to make demands, to express its desires. So again, a radical subjectification of the object. This is the trend, fine. But the question then becomes why? Why now? Why this line of thinking? In his celebrated essay, Thing Theory, Bill Brown offered one answer to these questions, presenting the turn towards things as symptomatic of a general weariness with postmodernism, of a longing for the simple pleasures of touch, taste, and material encounter in a world that seems to have been reduced to discourse, of a desire for things over theory, for the real lurking in the shadows of its representations. It's an impossible idea, an impossible desire, rather, he notes, one that only seems, in the end, to produce more irony, more paradox, and more essays about pencils, zippers, toilets, and bananas that really aren't about those things at all. The tragedy is that things inexorably slip back into thing theory, just as Russian constructivism perhaps ended up being more about the theorization of mass production than the actual material practice itself. All of this rehearses an observation Heidegger made long ago. The more we place things before us as objects of contemplation, the more they recede from us as inaccessible things in themselves. It's all very tragic. I would offer a somewhat different account than Brown and certainly than Heidegger. As an anthropologist, I read the late 20th century turn towards things less as a response to postmodern fatigue and more as a means of grappling with the heightened crisis of representation that arose just as thing theory, this recent iteration of it, got off the ground. By the start of the 1980s, powerful critiques by post-colonial scholars like Vine Deloria and Edward Said had begun to make it very difficult for Western analysts to write about other human subjects, particularly those in the colonized non-West, in the authoritative fashion to which they had become accustomed. Whether couched in terms of subalterity, Orientalism, or something else, the issue centrally revolved around the tendency to treat subjects, human subjects, as mere objects. Is it a coincidence that at just this moment, we began to turn our attentions away from human subjects and toward the object world, toward things rather than people? Is it a coincidence that just as human subjects became dangerous to represent, we began to turn objects into quasi-subjects and to talk about their worlds with the very sort of representational authority that post-colonial critics had taken away from us? Is it a coincidence that papers on the social life of things emerged just as Western accounts of the social lives of non-Western others became especially risky business? Here's my suggestion in a nutshell. In a post-colonial intellectual climate, objects make the perfect subjects because, unlike real human subjects, they can be so easily objectified. There are no IRB panels to worry about when you're studying toasters or Pez dispensers, in other words. From time to time, we even see an explicit acknowledgement of this peek through the surface of some of our contemporary texts within the greater literature of thing theory. As, for example, when Graham Harman writes in Guerrilla Metaphysics that, quote, "For all the endless diatribes against Orientalism, objects themselves are a perpetual Orient, harboring exotic spices, gilds, and cobras." If the avant-garde of the 1920s asked if the object can help us liberate the human masses, contemporary thing theory seems to be asking if the object can ever liberate itself. Can the object speak? This is the strange new question of what we might call the new post-colonial post-humanism. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you. That was great, both of you. That was really amazing. Gayatri Spivak was just in this room just a couple of nights ago as an attendant at something, so I'm thinking of, can the object speak? What she would think about that. Well, I'm just here to say that we'll take some questions. We're running a little late, but that's okay. But maybe we'll take 5-10 minutes of your questions, and then we'll move on to the next presentations. So I see someone over here. So let's start with you.
Yes.
And please address them.
Is this working? Yeah. My name is Celeste Alquiaga, and I actually had a comment about your comments, your introductory comments, because I was very intrigued by your saying that under the socialist or communist regimes there wasn't any kitsch, or that actually that the socialist Russian Russian socialism was against kitsch because Stalin was a big, not only admirer of kitsch, but he produced incredible propaganda, very kitsch propaganda films. And kitsch has been used and has been put to the use of totalitarian regimes, both fascist and communist, for a long time. But what I think is more important than that is actually two of the things that you mentioned about kitsch, and I think I think it's really important to rethink about kitsch right now that thing theory is so hot, because kitsch is exactly one of those things that has been despised for so long, and I believe that it is simply just still not understood. I would position it as the modern, not modernist, but the modern object par excellence. It is a response to it is a product of industrialism and of mass production, and the fact that it has been very criticized has precisely to do with the avant-garde positioning itself as the modernity, as the modern phenomena, whereas kitsch and leaving kitsch to the shadow of that, in the darkness of that, whereas kitsch very much represents that incredible, not only production level, but also the subversion. I know this is a hard word to connect to kitsch, but the subversion of many of the tenets that the avant-garde was trying to hold, such as originality, for example. So without really getting too much into it, I think that two of the things that you said were, or that you brought up, are really connected to kitsch and to a way of rethinking about kitsch. And one of them has to do with the idea of leftovers, because kitsch is a big consumer itself of leftovers, in the sense of whenever there's something falls out of the mainstream or falls from current circulation, then it easily becomes kitsch, as there is not only...
have to hurry you up a little bit, just because of our time.
As there is not only a production of kitsch, but it's
Yes.
mainly about the use and consumption of kitsch. And the other thing has precisely to do with the notion of recycling and the way that kitsch can be, is very much a big recycler of fashions and, and discourses. So that's...
Thank you. Let's take one more or two more questions, and then maybe we can bundle them together since we're so short on time. Or a lot of hands here. Let's see if you can keep them short. We can take all three of you in this row right here, starting in the beginning.
Christina, I just wanted to ask you if you could just say something about what were the objects precisely that were described as black and mournful that were trying to be gotten rid of and were so were being changed? Would those be abstract paintings?
Okay.
Hi, Christina Severin. My name is Daria Dorish. I just was wondering, a question to both of you. Since we're talking about objectness, I'm wondering how much this really has to do with Walter Benjamin's essay about that the hardest thing for us to change is ownership and property, and that objects are about property and ownership, and we're having a huge conflict about that because we're in a digital ephemeral moment where we're stuck between analog and digital. Which way to go? Just a thought.
And let's take the last question. Was there one more?
Yeah. It's kind of already showed up with the kitsch question, but with your kind of introduction of the post-humanist aspects of things theory that goes with, I guess, kind of the speculative realist kind of fashion, which you're kind of arguing as this kind of like historical kind of a progress, but also looks really kind of reactionary in a lot of ways. And the thing which it reacts against is the anti-humanism of this kind of avant-garde leftist modernism, which was already in the 20s kind of looming socialist realism and Stalinism, as we just had kind of mentioned. And so I guess I would like, I was going to ask if maybe both of you could maybe unpack the stakes of this kind of the anti-humanist project, where subjectivities are dissolved into systems, and and that objects become mixed up with these kind of weakened or fractured objects, and this other, I think, kind of desperate attempt to save the humanist kind of subject and to avoid these kind of like messy issues of subjects just being, kind of messed up by making subjects of objects.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to leave most of this to you. I'll just say very briefly, I was condensing a lot of stuff into very brief sentences. There was certainly the intention to fight against kitsch and what was known as bad taste, both in Russia and in the rest of the Soviet bloc in different forms and different times. It is not to say that there was no such thing as kitsch. Kitsch is certainly in the eyes somewhat of the beholder, and Stalin certainly had a different relationship to it than in the post-Stalin period, and that when you look at something like Stalin's wedding cake styles, there's a tremendous amount of kitsch that comes especially in the Stalin period, but there's also no question historically that there were great political campaigns waged against bad taste, what they would consider to be bad taste, and the idea of kitsch as a leftover of a decadent bourgeois way of life that needed to be eradicated in order to introduce the new, efficient, socialist way of life. And what I was trying to point out is simply the irony that some of the things that were introduced in that attempt themselves today simply look exactly like kitsch and maybe functioned exactly like kitsch. So it didn't really work, but you have this large discussion about kitsch during in various phases in different ways during the different socialist periods. So the four issues, which I'll just briefly remind us of, that there's a question of kitsch as leftovers and recycling, the modern object par excellence and its relationship to things and to productivism, presumably. What were those black and mournful objects that Rodchenko was talking about? What is the large question here, the role of property and ownership in a digital age as regards things? And what's at stake in this seemingly anti-humanist project that comes with thing theory?
Yeah, because I have some thoughts on this. I guess I'll start with the simplest, well, it's not a simple question, but to answer Amy's question about what are the black and mournful slaves, I think they're quite specific for him at that moment. In the context of his letters, he keeps talking about all the things he sees in Paris. And I think it's wrapped up quite specifically in the women. I think it's very sexual for him that he keeps coming back, kind of picking at this sort of scab of these women in their tight skirts. I think he feels this kind of public sexuality on the streets, and he associates that with objects. So he keeps talking, about the bidets in the hotel rooms, and the double beds. He says double beds or 3-person or 8-person beds. He's just obsessed with how big the beds are. So I think that there's kind of this association of objects in Paris with a kind of sexuality that seems really different to him. That seems to come out of some kind of capitalist commodification. And the black is quite specific. I mean, I think he has, this is not unusual for Russians who go abroad, but a kind of a very complicated and not so great kind of fetishization of Africans as well. And he talks about seeing blacks sort of in the movie theaters, the women who work as servants, as domestic servants, laughing at Charlie Chaplin films. So there's some kind of both a real interest and an interest in, a kind of a sense, I'm coming from a place that's not racist. The capitalist West is racist, sort of coming straight out of Lenin, and his kind of wanting to embrace that in a kind of not very sophisticated way. But so I think the black and the slaves, it's all quite specific. And no, I don't think he has anything against abstract painting. I mean, he used to make abstract paintings. Now he's a productivist, so he makes objects. But I don't think it's a modernist rejection of earlier kinds of art. I think it's tied up. It's quite specific. But to get to this larger question of kitsch, and this is very close to my heart because I'm working on Stalinist art in the 30s now, and I think it's very interesting, this idea of, that kitsch is an idea I've worked with, but more that at this later moment under Stalinism, the whole model of the originality of the avant-garde is just no longer relevant. That kind of hierarchical top-down, one person surpasses the work of the previous artist, and something like Malevich or something like that. now it becomes about repetition. As a friend of mine has coined the term sincere repetition. You're meant to kind of sort of sincerely produce these images and objects in a way that, I'm interested in the term laterality, that sort of we're all working together horizontally as opposed to the kind of hierarchical model, and that if that produces something that's not original, that's fine. Kitsch isn't an interesting way to describe it. It's just a new way of doing things. And I think that can circle back to let us think about this question of the anti-humanism of the avant-garde. And you know, I thought it was so interesting that you brought up Graham Harman, because it's like this whole new world of thinking about the object relations. And I think I would say that the Constructivists, with their use of objects, are totally humanist, right? I mean, it's about the comrade. I mean, that is exactly, you know, here we've got Rodchenko's Workers' Club here, this kind of, it seems anti-humanist. We're all going to sit up straight. We're going to be led into the light. We're going to be rational. This is not about subjectivity, or it's not about a kind of an individual subjectivity. But I don't actually think that that's how the club works, not the way at least he talks about it, and talks about it tenderly. He has a kind of a whole comradely, almost, you know, at various points seemingly even kind of sexualized relation to it. I think it's saturated through and through with humanism, and I think that under Stalin, as we progress, it's also, there's a kind of an insistence on subjectivity. It just has to be a particular kind of socialist subjectivity, but there's an interest in affect, emotion, feeling socialism. So I think that both of those are going against some kind of idea of anti-humanism. And I'm just very interested in this, I think of the Graham Harman, that kind of model of fitting in with basically the larger idea of affect theory right now, and this notion somehow, I mean, as you put it very well about the sort of, where everything's an object or everything's a subject, and there's nothing special about the human subject, right? Because I feel like what I take away from him is something like, you know, subjectivity is so 20th century, we're done with that, and this is this kind of new model. But maybe you want to talk more about that as well.
No, I'll just add to that. I mean, you know, Harman's very much in dialogue with Bruno Latour right now, and I think that Bruno Latour is put up on a pedestal as being a kind of key post-humanist scholar. I mean, this is his reputation, but I don't think that's actually right. You know, I think you're absolutely right. You know, that a lot of these allegedly post-humanist efforts, you know, are an effort to redefine humanism, perhaps, rather than to solidly be post-humanist. I mean, I think that this would be a misreading of a lot of these current moves to say that they're anti-humanist. I think that what the effort is to redefine what, you know, had been thought of as a liberal humanist subject along different lines. You know, so I mean, the classic text, "We have never been modern," really, for thinking through this, ends with a great plea that we be able to not do away with a world in which there are subjects and objects, but that we have the power to resort subjects and objects into new, you know, categories, new divisions, that we just allow ourselves to always remember that these are arbitrary divisions that we've constructed. You know, so I wouldn't say that much of this literature, although it talks in terms of posthumanism, is anti-humanist. You know, rather the intervention is different. Let's empower ourselves to be able, you know, to rewrite, as it were.
I was saying that posthumanism and anti-humanism are actually diametrically opposed, like after-humanist movements and thoughts, because most of like the speculative realist discourses I've encountered are actually are super anti-Marxist and anti-Kantian, and are interested in kind of retaining humanism. And I think that the Constructivists really love people, but they are militantly against the kind of notion of kind of Renaissance humans subjects which are solid and kind of enlightened, and in favor of this new subjectivity, which is more systems like whatever. And that it's really important to call out this watershed where the kind of this Stalinist regime and the aesthetics that go with this really brutally suppresses the constructivist avant-garde, which has become the kind of the Productivist movement. I'm sure that you weren't like us kind of like a general audience. We have to say that the like the kitschiness and the populism of socialist realism is completely against and suppress the abstraction and modernity of
I'm afraid that we're going
Wait,
to...
I just get to say one sentence.
One sentence, and then we have to move on.
I don't quite agree with what you're saying, but I thank you for bringing it up. And I would just say, when I was saying that the Constructivists are humanists, I didn't mean, of course, they're not Renaissance humanists. Of course, we all know they're against that. I was just using the term more loosely to say that they are deeply interested in the human subject, right? I mean, so I agree with what you just said, but I do think that there are certain, yes, of course, the Stalinist regime repressed or sort of made it impossible for them to continue their work as constructivists, and it was, needless to say, brutal and repressive. But I do think that there are aspects of art production under Stalin that just are more complicated, more interesting than we may think.
I'm afraid we really do need to move on, or we're going to go into we're going to go way too much into our coffee break. So I want to say thank you very, very much to our first two presenters and to the audience for their very good questions. Thank you very much.